Montana Territory, spring of 1876. The wind pulled at the rickety barn door as if it wanted to rip it clean off its hinges. But the real storm had already passed. She was standing right in the middle of it, bare feet in the dirt, arms wrapped tight around her ribs like they could hold her together if she just squeezed hard enough. Keziah Tallon was 19 and weighed less than a sack of seed. Her collarbones stuck out like fence rails, her dress hung off her like it had once belonged to someone bigger. It had, her older sister Miriam, who had died of fever last winter. They buried her in the same dress. Keziah only had one other, and that one was worse. "You ain't right for breeding," her uncle had said just an hour earlier, tossing her satchel at her feet like it was trash. "Too skinny. You'll bring no dowry, no strong sons. I got no use for you." He had taken the cow instead. Traded Keziah for a dairy cow from the Whitmore family out past the ridge. But even they had turned her away when they saw her, said she was too delicate, like she was some kind of broken doll. So here she stood, alone, with nothing but her satchel and the ache of being unwanted. The sky rumbled low as if it felt sorry for her. A horse's hooves struck the dirt behind her. Slow, steady steps. Keziah turned, squinting into the wind. A man on a paint gelding was approaching, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low to shield his face. He looked like a shadow cut out of the sky. When he drew closer, she saw his eyes first clear and pale, like the sky after snow. He dismounted in one smooth motion and walked over, reins in one hand, the other resting near the grip of the colt on his hip. "You all right?" he asked, voice low but firm. She swallowed hard. "I was given away for a cow," he blinked. "What? My uncle said I was too thin, traded me for a cow." The man stared at her for a long second, then looked down the road behind her like he wanted to ride back and knock her uncle's teeth out. Instead, he took a breath and looked back at her. "My name's Elias Granger. I've got a ranch about a half-day's ride from here. You got anywhere to go?" She shook her head. "You hungry?" She nodded. "Then come on," he said and held out his hand. Keziah hesitated. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a dust-worn coat. His boots were scuffed, his knuckles marked with old scars, but his voice was kind. And he had not looked at her like she was a burden. He had looked at her like she mattered. She placed her hand in his. The ride to Elias's ranch was quiet. He let her sit behind him on the saddle, her arms loosely wrapped around his waist. The wind stung her eyes, but for the first time in days, she felt something other than fear. The sun was dipping low by the time they reached a wide stretch of land nestled between two hills, a small cabin set against the slope. There were chickens, a fenced-in pasture, and smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, it was warm. Elias handed her a bowl of stew thick with potatoes and rabbit. She ate slowly, trying not to gulp it down, but he said nothing, just poured her a second bowl when she finished. "You live out here by yourself?" she asked, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Used to be my father's ranch. He passed 2 winters ago. I've got a few hands who come by during branding season, but otherwise just me." She nodded, staring into the fire. "You do not have to take care of me, I know, but I want to." Her eyes snapped up to his. "Why?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because someone should." "You're more than what they said. That uncle of yours is a damn fool." Keziah blinked fast, her throat tightening. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. "I can work," she said. "I know how to clean, cook, mend. I will earn my keep. You do not have to prove anything to me." His voice was quiet, sure. She looked away, unsure of what to say to that. Elias showed her to the small room off the back of the cabin. It had a cot, a quilt, and a little window that looked out over the pasture. "It is not much," he said. "It is more than I had this morning." She turned to him, then hesitated. "Thank you," he nodded. "Sleep, you're safe here." And for the first time in a long time, Keziah believed it. The next days passed gently. Elias was gone most mornings checking fences or riding the range, but he always came back by noon. Keziah kept busy. She cleaned the cabin, swept the porch, mended 2 of Elias's shirts, and started a vegetable patch behind the house. He never treated her like she was in the way. He asked her opinion on things: what kind of herbs to plant, where to move the chicken coop. He even let her ride his mare around the pasture one afternoon, laughing when she nearly toppled off and then caught herself. "You ever think about leaving Montana?" Elias asked one evening as they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. "Where would I go? Anywhere, Colorado, Texas, California." She shook her head. "I do not need far places. I just want somewhere I can breathe without worrying someone will take it away." He was quiet a moment, then said, "You can stay here as long as you want. No one's taking anything from you again." The way he said it, she believed him. 3 weeks passed. Then one morning, Elias came back from town with a boy on the saddle in front of him. The child was no older than 6. Hair wild, face dirty, but eyes sharp as a fox. "This is Zeke," Elias said. "Found him by the well behind the church. Said his ma left him there 2 days ago." "No kin." Keziah bent down. "Hi, Zeke." The boy stared up at her, mouth a hard line. "I know what it feels like to be left behind," she said softly. Zeke blinked once, then stepped forward and took her hand. Elias watched them, something soft flickering across his face. That night, Keziah tucked Zeke into the cot in her room and laid a pallet down for herself beside it. When she got up to leave, Zeke whispered, "You do not have to go," so she stayed. Weeks turned to months. Spring warmed into summer. The garden grew. Elias built a second coop, and Keziah taught Zeke his letters on a slate board by the fireplace. He was a fast learner, bright, eager. He followed Elias everywhere, and Keziah could see how Elias's face lit up when he called him Pa for the first time. One evening after supper, Keziah stepped outside to find Elias fixing a loose shutter. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "You never asked me why I was so thin," she said. He set the hammer down. "Did not matter." She turned to him, her voice small. "But it does to me." He looked at her, quiet. "I was always trying to be small enough to be loved, like if I just took up less space, someone would want to keep me." Elias reached up, touched her jaw gently. "You never had to be less than you are, not for me." "You are more than enough, Keziah," her breath caught. And then he kissed her. It was not rushed, it was not desperate. It was steady and warm like the earth beneath her feet. When he pulled back, she saw it in his eyes. He meant every word. "I love you," he said. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I love you too." And just like that, a girl given away for being too thin found a place where she would always be enough. The heat settled low across the land, humming through the June grasses like tired breath. Keziah stood at the edge of the creek, hem pinned up, feet cool in the shallows as she scrubbed Zeke's shirt against a flat stone. Elias had taken the boy to the north pasture to check on a calf born the night before, promising to be back before supper. A crow called from the cottonwoods lining the bank, and the sound reminded her of Missouri before the drought, before the deaths, before her uncle's hard eyes and empty hands. But memory didn't sting like it used to. Not here, not anymore. Behind her, the cabin's roof caught the late afternoon sun. The garden rows stood neat and green, the beans already climbing the trellis Elias had built from spare fence posts. She wrung the shirt out and spread it across a flat boulder to dry. The breeze smelled of dust and wild mint. A horse clopped slow over the ridge. She turned, squinting against the light. A man rode down the slope, older, his coat too fine for the dust it carried, his beard trimmed neat. He dismounted before he reached the fence. "You Elias Granger's woman?" Keziah folded her hands in front of her apron. "I am," he nodded once, not unkindly. "Name's Silas Rowan. I'm from the Sweetwater line. Elias bought a hay cutter from me last spring. I came looking to see if he's still needing the spare wheel I promised. He's out with our boy, should be back before dusk." Silas tilted his head. "Didn't know Elias had kin. We took Zeke in. His folks are gone." Silas looked over the land, eyes lingering on the coop, then the garden. "I remember when this place was nothing but brush and thistle. His father Jonas was a hard man, thought the land owed him something." Keziah said nothing. Silas looked back at her. But Elias, he's steadier, doesn't push the earth so much as walk beside it. She smiled just a little. Yes, he does. Tell him I'll be back in 2 days, that wheel's his if he still wants it. She nodded. Silas tipped his hat and mounted up, riding off without another word. By the time Elias returned, Zeke was asleep on the porch with a wooden horse tucked beneath his arm. Elias lifted him gently, carried him to the cot without waking him, then came back out, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "You see someone out here?" he asked, eyes narrowing toward the road. "Silas Rowan said he brought a part for the cutter." Elias leaned against the railing. "I forgot about that, wasn't sure he'd show." "He said you don't fight the land." He let out a quiet breath. "My father did. And it never gave him what he wanted." She stepped down off the porch and walked to him. "What is it you want?" He looked at her like she was asking him something he hadn't dared say out loud. "I want this," he said. Him, a life that doesn't break under its own weight." Her voice came soft. "Then we'll build it slow, strong." They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The quiet between them held more than words. Next morning, Keziah saddled the mare before sunrise and took the trail toward the canyon mouth. Elias had mentioned a patch of wild gooseberries growing near the shaded bend, and she wanted them for jam. She rode with care, eyes watching for snakes beneath the brush. The air was thick with pollen, bees humming low near the thistle blooms. When she reached the bend, she tied the mare to a scrub pine and stepped into the undergrowth, basket hooked over her arm. The berries hung heavy and dark, and she worked with steady fingers, filling the basket halfway before her back began to ache. She straightened, wiped her brow, and turned to leave and saw Elias coming up the trail, reins in hand, Zeke bouncing on the saddle in front of him. "I told you I'd bring some back," she said, surprised. Elias dismounted. "Zeke said you'd need help carrying it." The boy grinned, dirt smudged across one cheek. Together they walked back down the trail. Elias took the basket from her without a word, and Zeke held tight to her hand, swinging it as he skipped over the dry ruts. That evening, Keziah stood in the kitchen, stirring the bubbling pot as the scent of berries and sugar filled the room. Elias was outside with Zeke, mending the latch on the gate. She could hear the boy chattering, Elias answering in that steady, low tone of his. Later, as the jars cooled on the shelf, she stepped outside and leaned on the porch post. Elias looked up. "You make enough to feed the territory, only the ones I love." He set down the hammer, wiping his hands on a rag. "That a lot of people know," she said. "Just 2. His gaze held hers, warm and sure. "Then we're lucky," she nodded, and the last light of day caught in his hair, turning it gold at the edges. They stayed like that until the stars came out and Zeke fell asleep with a jar of jam clutched to his chest. By mid-July, the air held the weight of heat not yet broken. Keziah rose early to beat the sun, barefoot on the cool floorboards as she poured water into the basin. Zeke stirred in his cot but didn't wake, one arm thrown over the quilt Elias had stitched up from old flannel shirts. She washed her face and tied her braid low, fingers moving with practiced ease. The creek had thinned in the dry spell, and they'd begun hauling water from the spring near the cottonwoods. Elias had mentioned building a trough, something more permanent, but the days kept filling themselves before he could set the time aside. That morning he came in with a small canvas sack slung over his shoulder and a touch of dust clinging to his jawline. "There's a man in town offering a draft team for trade," he said, setting the sack near the door. "Wants labor for it, fence clearing mostly, nothing too hard." Keziah looked up from the stove. "You thinking of taking it?" He nodded. "Could use the horses." "Ours are good for riding, but not much for hauling." Her mouth thinned as she turned the cornmeal in the skillet. "How long?" 4 days, maybe 5. I'd be back by the 6th. She scraped the spatula slow across the pan. "I don't like the thought of you sleeping on some cot in town." Elias crossed the room and leaned one hand on the table. "I'll stay in the livery loft, safer than the saloon rooms. Zeke'll be with you." Her eyes met his. "That's not what I meant." "I know." He didn't ask her to say more. He never did. She packed him a tin of dried apples and the last of the jerky. Zeke clung to his leg until Elias crouched down and whispered something into the boy's ear that made him go still. When Elias stood, he touched Keziah's cheek with the back of his fingers, then stepped out into the morning light. The first night, the cabin felt too quiet. Zeke lay curled on his side, and she sat up with a cup of tea gone cold, listening for a sound that wouldn't come. The second night, she heard a coyote call from the ridge and bolted the door tight. On the third, she found Elias's shirt under the cot and held it until the moon passed the window. A knock came on the fifth day, not rushed, just 2 firm taps. She opened the door with her hand near the fire iron, but it was only a girl maybe 13 with a straw hat too big for her head and a sack clutched in both arms. "I'm looking for Elias Granger," the girl said. "He's in town." Her eyes darted behind Keziah. "He helped my ma, 2 winters back." She said if I ever needed a place. Keziah stepped aside. "Come in." The girl's name was Ruth. Her mother had died in childbirth 3 weeks earlier, third child lost in the same way. Her uncle in Bozeman refused to take her, said she was half wild and full of trouble. She'd walked near 20 miles with nothing but a biscuit and a flint striker. Keziah pulled out the second chair and poured her a glass of water. "You can sleep in the lean-to for now," she said. "It's dry and the roof doesn't leak. We'll figure more once Elias is back." Ruth's eyes were wary, but she nodded. Later that night, after Zeke had fallen asleep beside the hearth and Ruth laid curled in the shed with a blanket and lantern, Keziah sat on the porch steps and watched the wind move the grass. Her hands were still from the day's work, but her thoughts weren't. When Elias rode up just past dawn, his shoulders slumped with dust and sweat, she rose before he reached the gate. "There's a girl here," she said before he could speak. He dismounted with a grunt. "She all right, lost but holding," he nodded. "We'll keep her." That was all. He washed in the basin while she poured coffee, and when Zeke barreled out the door and wrapped his arms tight around Elias's waist, Elias bent low and held him without a word. Ruth came out later, face scrubbed, hair tied back with a bit of twine. "I'll sweep," she said. Keziah handed her the broom. "Start with the porch." By the following week, the rhythm had shifted. Ruth helped with laundry and gathered eggs. She didn't speak much, but she worked steady. Zeke took to following her like a pup, always asking questions she answered with a shrug or a nod. One evening, Elias and Keziah walked the edge of the pasture, their boots brushing through dry seed heads. "She's been through worse than she'll say," Keziah murmured. "I know the look," Elias said. "I've seen it in you." She stopped walking. "Do you still see it?" He turned toward her. "I see someone who built something from nothing, who chose to stay when she could have run." "I didn't know how to run." "I think you did. You just chose to fight." She looked down at her hands. "I used to think I was born to be passed over." Elias reached for her, cupped her face with one calloused palm. "You were born to be chosen, and I choose you, every day." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "Then I'll stay." "Every day." He kissed her, slow and sure, and the breeze stirred the tall grass around them like a quiet song. When they returned to the cabin, Ruth was helping Zeke feed the chickens, and the sun was dipping behind the ridge in a wash of copper light. Keziah took Elias's hand in hers, fingers laced tight. There were still fences to mend and a roof that needed patching before fall. But their hearts were steady, and their family, though built from cast-offs and grief, was whole. August came dry and hard-edged. The sky held no promise of rain, just that thin, brittle blue that stretched without mercy. Elias had started rising before first light, working to dig a new irrigation trench from the spring to the edge of the north field. The old channels had narrowed too much, and the squash plants were starting to wilt. Keziah stood near the edge of the porch with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder and a pair of Elias's boots in her hands. She'd resoled them with scraps of leather from an old saddlebag, and the stitching along the heel wasn't clean, but it would hold. "Your feet'll thank me," she said as she handed them over. Elias took them, brushing the dust from one toe. My feet'll curse me if you don't stop making them work. She smiled, eyes tracking the line of sweat at his temple. We've only got so many weeks left before frost. He pulled the boots on and stood, tall and sun-browned, the corner of his sleeve patched where he'd caught it on barbed wire 2 days earlier. I was thinking of cutting another row by the oats. That soil's soft enough. Keziah shaded her eyes with one hand. If Ruth can keep Zeke close, I'll help with the digging. I've got the reach for it. Elias paused, then said, You ever miss having more than this? She blinked. More than what? More than land and work and quiet. No, she said. I used to think noise meant safety, but it never did. He looked past her toward where Ruth knelt beside the henhouse repairing a splintered slat. She's got your steadiness. She's got her own, Keziah said. That evening, Elias brought in a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and set it on the kitchen table. Zeke was already nodding off beside the hearth, and Ruth had gone to the lean-to, where she'd taken to sleeping even though Keziah had offered the cot. You find something in town? Keziah asked, wiping her hands on her skirt. Elias unwrapped the cloth slowly. Inside was a sewing frame hand-carved, the wood dark with age but well-kept. Belonged to a woman in Dry Fork, he said. Her daughter's blind now, doesn't use it. Keziah touched the edge of the hoop. It's beautiful. I figured you could teach Ruth to stitch. She's always watching your hands when you mend. Keziah ran her fingers along the grain. You didn't have to. I wanted to. She looked up at him. You always give without waiting to be asked. He stepped closer. You always act like you've got to earn what's freely given. I'm still learning, she said. He nodded. So am I. Later, when the lamps were turned down and the night settled across the fields, Keziah lay beside Elias with her back to his chest, his hand resting loose at her waist. The air smelled of dry hay and warm skin. You think it'll be enough? She asked. What? This. The life we've made. His breath stirred the hair behind her ear. It already is. The next morning, Keziah found Ruth sitting on the porch with the sewing frame in her lap and Zeke beside her, threading a dull needle through a scrap of cloth. Ruth looked up, eyes steady. I want to make something that stays, she said. Keziah nodded. Start with thread, the rest will follow. By the second week of the month, the oats stood knee-high and green, and Elias had cleared the new field edge. Keziah spent her days between the garden rows and the kitchen, where jars lined the shelves with slices of apple packed in syrup. The sun beat down, but the work held a rhythm that comforted her. One afternoon, she came inside to find Elias at the table, writing with his head bent low, a candle stub guttering beside him. You're not one for letters, she said, setting the flour sack down. He looked up, thumb smudged with ink. It's not for me. Who's it for? A man I know out in Dillon. He runs a schoolhouse, doesn't have a teacher right now. Keziah tilted her head. You thinking of sending Ruth if she wants it? He'll board her and pay fare. But I won't push. She might not want to go, she might. Keziah looked toward the lean-to, where Ruth now kept her own small trunk with a few folded dresses and a comb Elias had carved from pine. You'll let her choose, Elias folded the letter. Always. That night, Keziah walked out to the coop, lantern in hand, and found Ruth already there, gathering eggs into her apron. There's a place you could go, Keziah said. A school, not far. Ruth adjusted her grip on the apron corners. To learn, to teach. I've only known how to watch and follow. Then it's time you led. Ruth looked down at the eggs, then back at Keziah. Would you be proud? I already am. Ruth's voice was quiet. You think I'm ready? You're more than ready. 2 days later, Ruth left with Elias at first light, her trunk tied behind the saddle and Zeke waving until the dust of the trail settled. When Elias returned, he found Keziah in the garden, hands deep in the soil. She rode with her head high, he said. She always would. He crouched beside her, pulling weeds in silence until she said, What would you have done if I'd never come down that road? I'd have lived, he said. But I wouldn't have known what it meant to feel full. She turned her face toward him, sun catching the line of her cheek. You've never asked me to be more than I am, she said. You've never been less. They sat in the dirt, knees brushing, and the wind carried the scent of turned earth and young roots. Around them, the land waited, quiet and sure, for what they would grow next. By September, the wind had shifted. It slid across the prairie cooler now, edged with the early breath of autumn. The hills had begun to yellow at the tips, and the garden had slowed its giving. Keziah stood in the root cellar one afternoon, hands dusty from turning the last of the potatoes. She moved with steadiness, her body lean but strong, shaped by months of work and steadier meals. Above her, the trapdoor creaked open. "I've got a question," Elias called down. She climbed the ladder, brushing dust from her palms. "If it's about the cider barrel, I already told Zeke not to touch it again." He grinned slightly, but it faded as he stepped aside and motioned toward the table. A long wooden box sat there, its lid propped open. Inside, nestled in a bed of wool, lay a set of finely carved spoons, each one shaped from a different kind of wood: ash, hickory, birch, pine. They were smooth, polished, and clearly handmade. "I made them for you," he said. "One for each season we've had." Keziah reached out and ran her fingertip along the smallest one, shaped from walnut. "You carved these?" "I needed something to do with my hands when the nights got long." She looked up, eyes softer than before. "I thought maybe you were writing letters again." "I wrote one," he admitted, "to the county clerk." That gave her pause. "What for?" He rubbed his neck, eyes not quite meeting hers. "To ask about marriage records, what's required." If you wanted," she stepped closer, fingers still resting on the rim of the box. "I thought maybe you didn't want to put a name on it, that it was enough like this." "I'd never ask you to change what didn't need fixing," he said quietly. "But I'd like to give you my name if it's something you'd want to carry." Keziah stood still a long moment, then reached up and took his hand, pressing her palm to his. "You gave me shelter before I had a name worth keeping. I'd be proud to take yours." They didn't kiss, not then. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her middle, and she leaned into the warmth of his chest. Eyes closed, the simple weight of promise settling over them like the hush before snowfall. They married beneath the cottonwoods 2 weeks later. Ruth came home for it, her hair now brushed and tied with a ribbon, her voice stronger than before. She stood beside Keziah while Zeke clutched a sprig of dried sage he'd insisted on carrying for luck. The man who performed the ceremony was the same Elias had traded fence work with earlier that summer. He brought his wife, who sang a hymn low and sweet when the vows were said. There were no rings, just a linen cord wound around their joined hands, and the scent of fresh bread rising from the cabin oven. After the guests were gone and Zeke had fallen asleep beside the hearth with his boots still on, Elias and Keziah sat alone on the porch. The moon hung full, casting silver light over the fields. "You remember that first night?" she asked. "When you rode up and asked if I had anywhere to go. I remember thinking you looked like you'd been swallowed whole by the world, and you looked like you'd wrestled it back open again." He reached down and took her hand, pressing her knuckles to his lips. "You made it worth the fight." They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. By late autumn, the roof had been patched, the final jars stacked in rows beneath the floorboards, and Ruth had returned to her schoolhouse with a satchel full of stitched samplers and a promise to come back for Christmas. Zeke had begun learning his numbers by carving them into the frost on the window panes, and Keziah had started a quilt from leftover feed sacks, each square stitched in the quiet hours after supper. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Elias stood by the window, watching the flakes drift across the yard. Keziah came to stand beside him. "I used to dread the cold," she said. "It always meant something was about to be taken." He turned toward her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "It won't take anything from us, not now." She leaned into his side, resting her head against his shoulder. "It gave me you." Outside, the snow gathered along the fence posts, soft and slow. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting its warmth across the walls they'd built together, and from that season forward, nothing in their world was missing, only growing, quietly, steadily, together.